Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds, and I'm here with Keith, co-star of my upcoming film, If, only in theaters May 17th. Do you want to tell people the big news? All right, I'll do it. Sign up now and you'll get unlimited for $15 a month and 6 months of Paramount Plus Essential Plan on us. MintMobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 equivalent to $15 per month. Unlimited over 40 gigabytes per month. Face lower speeds. Videos at 480p. Active Mint customers by 531.24 get 6 months of Paramount Plus Essential Plan. Auto renews after 6 months. Offer ends May 31st, 2024. Separate Paramount Plus registration required. Terms and conditions apply if rated PG.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot. We charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Everyone knows therapy is great for solving problems, but getting therapy has its own problems too. Like finding the right therapist, fitting into their schedule, and of course, the cost. Well, BetterHelp can solve those problems. It's totally online and built around your schedule. It's surprisingly affordable too. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat, all from the comfort of your home. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.
Andrew Jenkins would be surprising, yes. But who knows? Who knows in this mad world in which we now live?
Welcome to the Power Test. I'm Ayesha Hazarika.
And I'm Sam Freedman. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of The Power Test with me, Sam Freedman, and Ayesha Hazarika. The big news this week is that Ayesha is now in the same parliamentary party as Natalie Elphicke, which must be a delight for you, I assume. Have you met your new colleague yet?
I haven't had a chance. My new bestie, I have not had a chance. I think everyone is feeling very conflicted about this. It's very, very interesting. It has really set the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of Labour people, particularly Labour women. And I think people feel very conflicted because on the one hand, I think everybody can see the strategic ruthlessness of it, right? And I was speaking to some people I used to work with and they said, look, let's be honest, when we were advising Ed Miliband or Gordon or whatever, if we had got a defection offer like that from an arch right, not a wet Tory, an absolute hard line, you know, to the right of Genghis Khan sort of Tory, we would have jumped at it. We would have done, because the kind of raw politician in you is like, yes, this is an incredible scalp to have. But at the same time, I think you can hold two thoughts in your head, as I say so often. But on the other hand, it is pretty queasy in terms of her views on things and what she said about the victims of sexual abuse and what she said about other things. It is complicated. The other thing which I think was interesting and not well handled was, I think the apology coming later was messy.
Yeah. Could have happened at the moment of defection.
Correct. And one of the kind of rules of political management is if you do have bad news to get out of the way, get it all out the way at once, sort of do the announcements, do the due diligence, get it out the way first. And look, it was a great moment of theatre. Let's not kid ourselves. I interviewed Brendan Clark-Smith on my show and he was like, you know, he's a good friend of hers and he was like, they were all just baffled watching, you know, her walk across, and it was a moment of absolute shock on both sides of the house. So it was a great moment of theatre, but people are really conflicted about it. They totally get the political calculation, but I think they still feel quite queasy.
It's just one of those moments where I'm glad I'm not in a political party and I don't have to feel like I need to defend. I was in an office when it happened, and someone said Natalie Elphicke defected, and I just assumed to Reform. I mean, I just went, oh, to Reform.
Yeah.
I mean, I just couldn't imagine she would defect to Labour. So it was absolutely bizarre. But then to your point about the sort of these conflicts within politics and why these things are so tricky, late this week, a number of Labour MPs, Jess Phillips and others, pushed a motion in the House to ban people who've been arrested for rape and sexual assault from the estate. And the motion passed by one vote, and Natalie Elphicke voted for it. If she hadn't defected, that would have lost. Probably. I suspect she wouldn't have voted for it had she not defected. So there's a sort of raw politics. It's not just about the drama and so on. It's just about having the votes, right? It's having the numbers. You always want the numbers.
And also, I think the fact that she's standing down at the next election, it also helps. I think if she was still planning to stand, that would have been tricky.
And Labour have quite a good candidate in the seat.
Mike Tapp. Yeah, he's really good. He's really good. Also, I think the other thing that people forget, we've just talked a lot about the local elections 2024. In the local elections 2023, a real kind of coup for Labour was winning Dover Council, when all the issues about the small boats were raging. So I think Dover is a really important place for Labour, and they feel that they have made inroads. So I think strategically, winning Dover is very important.
Yeah, I actually think the fact that she's quite right-wing on issues like immigration is the problem, because to have someone like that supporting Labour on an issue like small boats is just politically helpful, given that Labour's policy is in fact not as aggressive as the Tory policy. The issue is really about the sexual assault allegations against her husband, the actual crimes that he committed, and the fact that she tried to defend them and attack the women involved. I think if it wasn't for that issue, the fact that she's right-wing wouldn't be so much of a problem.
Yeah, as somebody was saying to me, if you have been in the Conservative Party for a long time and you have chosen to dedicate your life to Tory politics, it's not just like you vote Tory, you've chosen to get selected and become a Tory politician, the chances are you're going to have lots of views that Labour people don't like. That's just a reality. Let's see what happens with this election. I'm going to say don't be completion. You're going to roll your eyes at this point.
I think we can assume Labour are going to win.
Sam, you can never. No, not a vote has been cast. Not a vote has been cast. But if Labour does win big, and when the history books are written, let's not kid ourselves. And I'm probably a bit more soft lefty. Let's not kid ourselves. The strategy to try and win over Tory voters and send that message has been incredibly important. Remember, we've come from a period under Corbyn where even Labour voters were told, why don't you F off and join the Tories? And then loads of people did at the 2019 general election campaign. So even though to somebody like me, I feel pretty uncomfortable by it, I can see the political calculus. But I think a question that a lot of people are asking, particularly a lot of women are asking, if Natalie Elphicke was allowed to apologise and kind of atone and be brought in, could the same principle not be applied to Diane Abbott? That's a question that I think a lot of Labour people are asking. I suppose the other question is, who's next for the defections? And the thing that would make me laugh so much is if Lee Anderson came back from Reform and joined the Labour Party.
I was trying to think who'd be the most unlikely Tory MP. I think Chris Chope. Or maybe Bill Cash.
Although I quite like Sir Christopher Jones. I always have quite fun conversations with him on my show. I wouldn't be that surprised. I think it would have to be a sort of Andrea Jenkins.
Andrea Jenkins would be surprising, yes. But who knows? Who knows in this mad world in which we now live? The sort of broader point, I guess, is this sort of that Starmer's team have a very clear strategy around, as big a tent as possible, as broad a church as possible, whatever cliche you want to use, trying to be sort of ecumenical about who you accept into the party, as you say, and sort of contrast to Corbyn and so on. That in turn causes tensions when it comes to policy, where you have very different interest groups within your coalition. And I think that goes to the topic we really want to focus on today, which is workers' rights and unions. And Natalie Elphicke is now presumably a fan of the New Deal for working people that Labour are.
She talks of little else.
I'm sure. After the sort of watering down of the package of green spending earlier this year, there's been a lot of tension around, do Labour water down some of the proposals they put out a few years ago on additional rights for workers, with some businesses are worrying about it, business organisations are worrying about it. Unions have been a bit upset. They then had a meeting this week where they seem to make up. But it sort of does illustrate some of these tensions, I guess, within what is an increasingly broad movement.
Keir Starmer and his team will probably never be as powerful as they are right now in the run-up to the general election, and then just right at the beginning if they win the general election. Because with a 20-plus point poll lead and the prospect of Labour coming into power, they're in such a position of strength, and there are so many people in the party, particularly across the union movement, who might have misgivings, but there is a sort of settled view that people will hold their nose and shut up to get Labour across the line, but then they will want to have some pretty tough conversations with Labour. And I think the New Deal for workers has been the one thing which the unions have been able to have. A lot has been rowed back on. Labour has absolutely love-bombed the business community, and they've made no apologies about that. That has made many union leaders very, very queasy. They think back to the sort of Gordon Brown prawn cocktail offensive with the City and the Tony Blair offensive. And they feel really, really uneasy about that. But this New Deal for Workers gave them a kind of landing point that they were like, it's fine, we've got this. And this was the sort of Angela Rayner bit. Rachel Reeves is schmoozing the City. Angela Rayner's bit was the sort of New Deal for workers. And I think what's really interesting is obviously behind the scenes, there have been tension, not just from the trade union movement, there's been tension from the business community, because what some business leaders are saying in private to Johnny Reynolds and Rachel Reeves and Tulip Siddiqui and others is, don't be too strident on these workers' rights stuff, because that's just going to be red tape for us, and that's going to hamper growth and stop us being entrepreneurial and all that kind of stuff. So there is this kind of behind the scenes, there's pressure from the unions to not weaken it and make it stronger. And there's definitely pressure from the business community saying, don't go too kind of mad with this. And I thought what was interesting is that sort of what was agreed was nothing actually very concrete, but it was tonally, we're not having a fight about this now, watch this space.
One of the interesting things for me about it is that in terms of public opinion, not necessarily business opinion, but public opinion, this stuff is really popular. When something that right-wing press is popular with the public, they talk about it a lot. Polls show that the majority of people want immigration reduced, so that's assumed to mean that that's the will of the people. But when it comes to something like workers' rights, the fact that it is actually incredibly popular, you wouldn't necessarily know that from reading the newspapers as an attempt to associate it with Labour's past. But there was a poll this week from Savanta that went through all of the things that we know about from this sort of New Deal, things like ending the practice of firing and rehiring, where you had not just the majority of voters supporting it, but 68% of Conservative voters supporting it, like wildly popular with Tory voters, or banning exploitative 0 hours contracts. 65% of Tories say that is something that they support. So from an electoral point of view, it feels like a very safe area for Labour. So really, it's just about their relationship with the business community and any worries they have about growth.
No, I think you're completely right, Sam. And I think one of the things that we politicians miss is that trade unions are often very in touch with what normal people think, because, shock horror, members of trade unions are normal people from across the social strata, from people who might be in quite insecure, low-paid work, right through to people who are middle-income work. And I always remember from the National Policy Forum back in the run-up to the 2010 general election campaign, when we all got together in Warwick with the trade unions and the affiliated parts of the Labour Party to kind of thrash out what should be in the manifesto. And I remember as an advisor sort of being told, oh, the unions are going to ask for everything and it's unrealistic and, it's not in touch with what normal people think and we'll have to sort of push back. And that's what the kind of mantra was. But actually, when you look back at what the trade unions were raising in the run-up to the 2010 election, all of those things have come to pass. They were raising issues about job insecurity. They were raising issues about globalization, not in a very negative way, but about kind of wage insecurity. They were raising issues about housing and things like that. So I'm very pleased that Labour is embracing business. I personally think that's very important, but I hope that is not at the cost of the relationship with the trade unions and their members, because there is this misconception that trade unions don't speak for ordinary people, and they really, really do. Often trade unions are actually more in touch with ordinary people than, the CEO of a hedge fund company or something like that.
I would say usually.
Yes, usually one would say. Well, look, let's now introduce our special guest for this edition of The Power Test. Delighted to be joined by Mike Clancy. Mike is the General Secretary of the Trade Union Prospect. He was elected in 2012, and he also sits on the General Council of the Trade Unions Congress. Mike, welcome.
Good morning, and it's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what your union does and how it relates to the Labour Party? Because I don't think it's affiliated. So just explain the difference to our listeners between those two forms of union relationship.
So first of all, it doesn't appear sometimes like this in the national media, but most trade unions don't affiliate to the Labour Party. And that's probably because of the composition of their membership. So take Prospect as an example. We are primarily a private sector union, but we, of our 158,000 members, and we're a growing union, which is a really positive place for us to be. We have about 40,000 members in public service, and generally, because of the obligations they would have to serve the government of the day, then we have historically not affiliated to the Labour Party. To be honest with you, our relationship, though, with the Labour Party is a strong one because as a progressive organisation, most of our values align with those of the main progressive party. I mean, we do take our obligations to speak across the political spectrum very seriously, although relations with the current government now are pretty attenuated, if not non-existent. We would say that's because of their policy direction rather than our choice. Prospect itself, so we represent, as I always say, fascinating people doing fascinating things. We probably are the representatives of the organised middle class, everything from air traffic controllers, power engineers, government scientists, government specialists, through to the people who make all of your favourite film and TV output. So the end credits of most of the programs that you would watch or major films, we represent all the crew. And a lot of those are freelancers. So we touch all different types of employment form, both direct and indirect. But primarily our focus is on private sector employers. And I think that public-private mix gives us a particular ability to talk about the issues of the day from both perspectives.
Tell us a bit about your sense of a bit of the theatre, I guess, that's been going on around the New Deal for working people. This is something we talked a bit about in the introduction, but this is Labour's big sort of pledge to working people, includes both sort of increased workers' rights and taking back some of the anti-trade union legislation that this government have put forward. What's your sense of how much there really has been a dispute between some of the other sort of affiliated unions and so on and Labour? And where do you think they've ended up now after the meetings over the past few days?
What I think we'd have to remember is the context here. British capitalism's had pretty much untrammeled authority for 14, 15 years. There's been a significant deregulatory agenda. I don't think that's brought us economic benefit. And consequently, a lot of trade unions are dealing with members who are in relative distress, and indeed a lot of members who have been the subject of that management prerogative, which has driven a lot of decision making in our economy. The contrast with other international jurisdictions couldn't be stronger. And I think, therefore, when unions are focused on trying to rebalance this legislative onslaught that there's been, I think it's not surprising, therefore, that they've got a strong agenda and they want to see quite a lot of that delivered. I think, unfortunately, we've probably seen a situation where simply the question of practical implementation of a lot of agreement on policy direction has, maybe in the media and by some participants, been turned into a struggle, which is probably unnecessary to have. We regard the New Deal as the starting point of an improvement in worker voice, well-being and employment rights. A turn away from the approach whereby you could be forgiven for believing it's a race to the bottom and where deregulation trumps all. So we welcome it. We are not a union that likes to get into debates which are too polemical and too binary. I mean, there is a problem with our political discourse generally. There's too much purity, too many things where we should actually be more pluralistic in our ability to listen to different voices. And maybe there's been a bit of that gone on in recent weeks, because ultimately any major program of change has to go through practical implementation steps in Parliament. And I don't think we should mistake practical implementation for stepping away from the underlying principles. So I hope that the conversation yesterday, where there seems to be some positive mood music, but we will see in due course, means that we've reconciled some of that. I think with some better management overall, there's no need to be having public fallings out about this.
And speaking of public fallouts, Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, sort of stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest recently. I mean, he wrote a piece in the Sunday Times arguing that Labour mustn't rush these proposals. They must reassure investors about red tape. And he said that Labour shouldn't betray business. What did you think of that intervention? Because he's obviously very much speaking up on behalf of business, who he does a lot of work with.
Well, look, I mean, I wouldn't put it in the terms that article did, because it prompts a reaction to the contrary. But the reality is what unions do, and we don't talk about this enough, is solve problems with employers day in, day out. I often complain to my own union colleagues that we spend too much time talking about disputes, which probably are situations we get into 10, 15% of the time. Up and down the country, union representatives in local environments, union officials are working with employers successfully about change, about technology, about pay and conditions, about equal pay, about a whole range of things. The thing which catches the headlines, as you know, is when we have a dispute. What we need to focus on, the fact is that unions and employers are two parts of a success story. And to have that success story, both need to be good at talking to each other. We could talk for ages about how actually the skills of negotiation on both sides have probably atrophied in recent years. Unions are used to compromise, negotiation, and longer term relationships. Now, what's important is that business reciprocate. What's also important is that business must realise that the architecture of our labour market, the underlying regulations, have been too far in favour of their prerogative now for too long. Good business is not going to be concerned about Labour's programme, because good business is not trading just on cost. It's trading on innovation. It's trading on having a good relationship with its workforce. So I think that actually it is right that Labour talks to employers, both their institutions and significant employers, as well as talking to unions.
See, I really agree with lots of what you've said there, Mike. On your point about actually what is not often reported is what can be a very productive relationship between bosses and union leaders. I remember the great late Jack Dromey, who was a great union man. And
yeah, I knew Jack well.
We all kind of thought the world of Jack, and he, of course, became a Labour MP for Erdington. I always remember him giving me such a great kind of education about the really productive relationship, particularly in the car manufacturing sector, where the sort of big car manufacturers worked really, really closely with trade unions through some really difficult times. And why is it, do you think, that we don't hear more about those stories? We always hear about this very adversarial relationship between business and trade unions, whereas actually it can be incredibly productive through difficult times for business.
So I would say there is some strands of the trade union movement who think that success in terms of membership acquisition comes from being relentlessly adversarial. I personally don't agree with that. I think union members want their unions to solve problems, to avoid disputes, to contribute to productivity and industrial peace, but to make sure that their interests are fundamentally looked after. And that if a dispute becomes necessary, it's something that's down the line when all other things are exhausted. However, that doesn't make headlines. Union solves dispute and avoids economic disruption is not something that people have beaten the path to my door to hear about. But I could give you many examples of where we do that, month in, month out. And with employers, literally had a couple in our building this morning, saying about the quality of the relationship they have with us and actually asking us, and where we see it in our members' interest to do it, could you lobby on this? Could you ask about that? That's difficult for us to say. Can you engage with us on this? Unions are at their best. We're working productively with employers about the future of their sector, industry, enterprise, or profession. We've got our air traffic controllers in our building today, very high profile profession, where they will routinely talk about the future of the profession, the future of the institutions that support it, as well as their terms and conditions. If we can find a space in which employers want to join us in that conversation, hopefully we can influence the media, because ultimately I think that's the way to union success and union renewal. The most important thing in the next 10 years for trade unions is to address the decline of trade unionism in the private sector. We have 12% union density and about 21% collective agreement coverage. And I say relentlessly, unless we turn that round, double it to the heady figures of 24% of trade union membership and so on, the public sector will also suffer. Because when the right eventually comes back to power again, as it inexorably does in our parliamentary system, the public sector looks like it's different because it's got unions, it's got pensions, it's got this, that and the other. The private sector don't have it. Trade unionism in the private sector is quite different. You have to understand the commercial posture of the organisation, its products, its challenges and so on. But actually, some of the most productive relationships I have are with private sector employers because they know we understand their business. They know we're in it for the long term, and we're reasonably confident that they have reciprocal long-term trust relationships with us so that even if we fall out, we find a way back together. This is crucial to Labour's mission if they get into power and they get to terms. We've got to move away from the adversarial challenges we particularly had in the last 2 years, but that's just been trouble brewing, into how do we have a social democratic solution such that businesses can flourish, but working people are not left behind.
To Ayesha's point, I think one of the reasons why you don't get this narrative is because a lot of the media and the Conservative Party have bought into this still use a narrative that's 40, 50 years old about union-industrial relations. If you see a story, it's all winter of discontent and miners' strike and Arthur Scargill. This is sort of stuff that happened when I was a toddler. It's not relevant to today. And what you've seen since then, obviously, is that the nature of the labour market industries in the UK has changed massively. Unions have become much more sort of focused on professional, higher earning workers in many cases, particularly, as you say, the growth of the public sector unions is part of the wider picture. And a lot of businesses have changed their kind of mindset as well. And you can see that in their attitude to Labour at the moment, where they're actually pretty warm towards Labour. Labour's Business Day, I think, at conference sold out in about 10 minutes this year. So it feels like there's actually a very different kind of union movement, a very different kind of employer. And yet we're still, when we're having headlines about it, it's still pictures of Arthur Scargill. And I don't know what we need to do to shift that picture.
I think you're so right. And the cliched optic of who is a union leader is still kind of stuck in the past, because there's actually a lot of amazing women who lead trade unions now. You look at, Unison, which I think is the largest trade union in the country at the moment. That's led by Christina McAney, who is an absolute powerhouse. You've got Sharon Graham leading Unite now. So even the sort of cliche about the brothers and the barons is not quite accurate. And I would also argue that one of the reasons why we do have this very outdated view of unions is because there's very few correspondents dedicated to covering union. Like Alan Jones, who is a brilliant veteran industrial correspondent on Press Association, he's like the kind of only real kind of long-standing Labour. Even though we're in an era where we've got so many strikes at the moment, it does feel like, Mike, that there does need to be a sort of a modernisation from, a sort of, maybe it's a PR job. I mean, how do you think a sort of incoming Labour government could help with that? Do you think they'll want to help with that?
I believe the dialogue we'll have with Labour will be much better. And you've mentioned some of the women who now lead major unions. Now, talking to female colleagues, and I'm proud of the fact that my own senior management team is majority female, and we've made great steps in the union overall, but this is a constant work, and there's many things we can improve upon. Sometimes I think female leaders, though, make it despite the structures, not because of. And sometimes I think female leaders, but it's for them to speak to this, not for me, but I'm just giving you an opinion as you've asked for it. They probably still have to sometimes indulge in rhetoric and behaviours that are urged onto them, which probably don't help some of the points that you've both made, which is that we reach for the adversarial because we're expected to fill that space. I think there's plenty of evidence now that the average trade union member is a female graduate. The union movement has changed considerably, but we've got to continue to work at that. And I think what unions have to be prepared to contemplate is some of the things that are natural for business, for private sector, brand, offer. Unions can be quite Fordist. We sometimes speak to people quite preachy. We do it this way because we know what's best. Now, with unions, because we're democratic, you have to have means of convening people with a degree of structure and forming opinion that is sufficiently representative of a cohort of people. But we can be a bit Fordist. We do it in this colour and this way because we know best. In my own union, we're trying to move away from quite a bit of that. It's a challenge. Can't say we get it right on all occasions, but we're trying to be more responsive. We do talk about internally, which going to sound heretical, customer service, member service, making sure that we respond to members as individuals, as well as giving them a collective sense of their own power and worth in the labour market. Where I think Labour will help, but this is where unions have to step up to the mark. First of all, the New Deal gives new opportunities and new doors to be open to organising. But it's up to unions to have an offering that's attractive, flexible enough and of interest to different generations and different groups in the economy. But Labour's going to open that door, up to unions to go through it. Labour's also going to want to talk to unions industrially. There's quite a lot of conversation about industrial strategy, which is welcome. Civic society will be part of that with business. So unions have got to be there. Unions have got to be equipped economically. Unions have got to be numerate. Unions have got to have good business cases. I think if unions can do all of that, Labour will convene more with unions, and therefore you'll see more of where unions are solving problems, which is what we do, and occasionally having a dispute. And sometimes the public will be with us. The public will have been with us in some of the public sector disputes. Everyone knows the railway is a complete economic disaster. And there is a great deal of sympathy to the railway unions as they try to battle through that. So, yes, there's a space for disputes, but I actually do think that with the New Deal, with Labour's change in mood music, provided unions step up to that mark, the image of unions will change.
I'm interested in this sort of point around growing private sector people in unions and what the barriers are to that. You've talked a bit about the sort of policy barriers that Labour might reduce. Do you think there's something from the sort of side of younger workers that they don't even sort of, it's not sort of something they've experienced or understood, or it's sort of almost occurred to them that this is a sort of option? So there's a gap in knowledge or understanding that also makes it quite hard to then persuade people that this is something that they would want to do.
Well, I've never believed in a lost generation of workers who won't join trade unions. What I do think is that unions can still be better at asking people to join. Labour will remove some of the obstacles to that happening. There will, I think, be an output for both digital and physical access that employers will be expected to provide to trade unions that they don't have to now. And digital access is extremely important. Unions being and shaping up their digital capacity to be able to do that successfully. Union messaging, I think, is getting better at reflecting different people's interests in the labour market. But is there a case that the media tell people you don't need a union, and if you do need a union, all they're going to do is take you out on strike? Well, of course, we are battling against that. Away from work, I spend my time with people away from politics and unions. So normal people might say. It's really interesting that when people talk about, what do you do for a living? I usually say I've got a job that either begins or ends the conversation, because people either want you to advise them, or people have an impression, usually stereotypical. Oh, well, particularly for me, you're from Liverpool and you're a trade unionist. Well, enough said. So that barrier, that perception is real. And it is about the 40 or 50 year ago narrative that is trotted out. Yeah. But that's going to be the case in the media for some time. What we've got to do is relentlessly point to, here's the successes over here. This is how we successfully avoided this dispute. This is how we actually work well with this employer about organizational change. And let's take a massive issue here. We will not successfully change our labour market, ensure that people are not injured, unless we have a national conversation about AI, organizational design, and what that's going to mean for people, particularly in the private sector, but public as well. And that's a very good area where there should be coming together of views between employers, trade unions, and civic society.
I mean, what's really interesting listening to what you're saying, Mike, is you're making the case that I actually think a lot of normal people would buy into, which is that the essence of a trade union is having a strong friend at work. And right now, I was just listening to a phone-in just before I jumped on this about the labour market figures, and the number of people who are ringing in who are middle-class people who have just lost their jobs. And they have no clue what to do. The refrain I'm hearing again and again is, who can help me? Who can give me some advice? I don't know my way around a job centre. I don't know what to do. And this concept of a strong friend at work feels so pertinent right now with all the insecurity that people are facing. So it feels like this should be a really important moment for the unions to sort of reach out to people, saying that we can really help you and we can be important to you. But Sam, I mean, that's all well and good, but we have discussed many times on this podcast the reality of, after the party's over, if Labour wins the election, the pressure that Rachel Reeves is going to come under and Keir Starmer. I imagine, even though Mike has made a very good argument about collaboration and being positive and looking at the good things, Sam, don't you think that one of the first things that will dominate a new Labour government will be some of the trade unions coming to see Rachel Reeves and saying, right, we've got to talk about pay deals?
Yeah, one of the flashpoints could be around the New Deal, could be this sort of fair sector deal for care workers, which is featured, and I think is a great idea and really important because care workers are badly underpaid, and it's one reason we have a massive vacancy crisis. But one of the reasons for that is because government subsidise a lot of care. And so if you want people to be paid more, the government needs to cough up more money. That's an immediate clash point. And then, as you say, you're going to have potential clash points on pay deals. I think for instance, the school teacher pay review body this summer is going to recommend a pay levels of between 4% and 5%, which the unions will probably be happy with as a number, though they might not say it. But if the department isn't given money to pay for it, if schools aren't given money to pay for it, they are not going to be happy about that, because it means disadvantaged kids losing out as a result of a pay deal, and they will push back on that. So these are all issues that Labour are going to have to sort of deal with very, very early on, I think, in a government. How do you manage not just the pay deals, but the cost of the pay deals? How do you deal with the ongoing dispute that junior doctors have? That needs to be resolved desperately. How do you do this sort of fair pay deal for the care sector without it costing billions and billions? So there'll be a honeymoon period where people will want to get on with each other a bit, but there'll also be a lot of potential flashpoints pretty quickly on.
Look, this is close to home. The people I represent, privileged to represent civil service, I've seen a 26% real term cut in their terms and conditions. And the people that Prospect represents in the civil service are ones with private sector analogues. their regulatory inspectors, their engineers, their scientists. But for their commitment to public service, they could earn a lot more. That's what's causing the drain now in the civil service. And we will be saying to Labour, you need to recognise what's happened over this period and what you're going to do about it, particularly if you want to deliver these missions. This is a massive programme of expectations management. The way I would put it is that the best relationships we have with the private sector is when they open the books and they say, look, this is what we can really afford. This is where we are in terms of our delivery products or whatever it may be. Let's talk this openly with you as trade union partners. It's not impossible to do that on a national and sector basis and demonstrate a direction of travel over time to right some of these wrongs. It's not gullible to say, I believe it, when it's pointed out that the economic conditions of late 24, 25 are worse than 97. And therefore, we have to talk to Labour as an employer of our members in terms of an overall direction of travel against the fiscal position. Labour can help with some of this stuff because simply take the civil service context. There's going to be a more respectful dialogue about who civil servants are and how to value them by comparison to the current administration. But Sam, you're right, there is going to be a difficult space, probably in the first 6 months or so of 25, where all of this will play out and honeymoon periods could evaporate. This is where long-term leadership of the unions and long-term leadership of the country need to try and come together. Because ultimately, what we're really talking about is having to drive a more productive, well-invested private sector to drive the tax receipts, to drive the expenditure available, to have the best possible public services that we can afford. And we have a woeful record on investment here. So we need to have a very strong proposition as well to the investment profile in a whole range of sectors. It needs to be on the basis of fair treatment of workers, but it needs to be on also with a clarity of, if you need to invest in things over 10, 15, 20 years, here's policy stability. So, we talk about this in the nuclear area, in energy, parts of defense and aviation. You need to give investors a belief that if they invest, this is going to be the return and they're going to have relative policy stability.
Yeah, and you've also got just a basic market problem. We don't have anywhere near enough teachers coming into the profession. We don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough, the civil service.
You don't have enough engineers. You don't have enough people with STEM skills. A lot of the infrastructure stuff is actually troubled by the availability of these sort of people.
I think what's really interesting is when you hear all these conversations about growth, this pursuit of growth is a key mission for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. What I've noticed is there's a lot of talk about how to leverage an expertise from the business side of things, which is very, very important. But you don't often hear that much about trade unions being part of this growth strategy as well, which is so important when you think about how important skills are to getting growth in the country as well.
I mean, one of the fastest growing unions in the world is Unionen, who are a middle management specialist union in Sweden. And the Swedish labour market does remain a very interesting piece of study. What I like about Swedish and some of the Nordic unions is they're not frightened to change. They prepare their members for change. They have obviously a social construct working with government, primarily social democratic governments, but nonetheless a social construct, which is about preparing the labour force for change, but not just on unilateral terms dictated by employers. We've got to find that alchemy for the UK. We ensure that we have the support mechanisms that allow people to adapt, to cycle through different forms of employment, to probably also look at the boundaries between public and private. I mean, a number of the places where we represent members, take defence as an example, the very close alignment between public and private, probably more permeable boundaries needed in the future. Some of this might sound heretical, but actually we have to ask ourselves some of these deep questions, because private can learn from public and public can learn from private. And there shouldn't be ideological opposition to that. Ultimately, we've got to find a way to have a 10-year programme of renewal here, and it's going to require a degree of early patience from all parties.
Well, that feels like a very positive and interesting note on which to wrap our conversation up, Mike. But before we let you go and let you escape, we've got some sort of quick fire round questions. So if you could pick anybody dead or alive to join Keir Starmer's fantasy cabinet, who would you put in there?
So I thought about this. Barbara Castle, someone who I would agree with many of her political positions, although for a period she was not pro-Europe. But in place of strife, that whole period feels it's still apposite now. We still have equal pay issues. We need the absolutely strongest female role models in national leadership. So Barbara is my choice.
Oh, I'm beaming at that, Mike. You could not have made me more happy with that choice. That's the best one we've had so far.
And one of the best writers of diaries as well. Diaries
Indeed.
are absolutely fascinating. Okay, second question. What issue do you not think is being talked about enough and you'd like to bring up the Labour Party's agenda?
So whilst I understand the pragmatic politics as we head towards an election of not making Brexit a doorstep issue, the simple fact is we have an economic gap as a result of leaving the European Union and a broader damage to our national life that Labour will have to answer fairly early if they are into power. And I would hope that they are doing the thinking necessary to be in a position to start to be honest with the country about the grave mistake we made in leaving the European Union. And I'm allowed to say that not just because that's Mike Clancy's view, but also what I do know is that 70% of Prospect members voted to remain. So I am at least located in the majority opinion of Prospect members at the time.
And what, for you, is the ultimate power test for an incoming Labour government?
It's not going to surprise you, is that they show the commitment, even if they do get some ongoing fire from government, that they're going to change the labour market. But they're going to do it collaboratively. They're going to do it incrementally, but they're going to do it with determination. The model should be, but in the opposite direction, what the Conservative Party did in the 1980s. They had a 1980 Employment Act. They had a 1982 Employment Act. They had a 1984 Employment Act. They had a 1988 Employment Act, and so on. And you look back over a decade and you suddenly thought, my word, this doesn't look like anything like it used to be. Labour needs to have the same vision and that same commitment. And we need to work with them on that, because this is the chance to create a different labour market, one that is not based upon utter worship of free market principles. It's probably going to be a bit of Keynes and a bit of contemporary economic thinking. And we've got to be determined that actually British capitalism will flourish with good regulation and good employment rights.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you are not a member of the Power Test crew, you can head to the powertest.co.uk or the powertest.substack.com. You'll get episodes ad-free and early before anyone else. And there's also an exclusive chance to be part of the podcast and lots more. Also, do get involved with us if you've got any questions or comments or ideas you'd like us to explore. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us on pod@thepowertest.co.uk. You can also get involved on social media as well.
And we've also got our brand new YouTube channel, which is Power Test Pod, and you can find clips on there. The Power Test only exists because of the amazing support from you, our members, and our supporters. And we're also delighted to have the backing of some brilliant organisations like the Future Governance Forum, which is providing intellectual and practical infrastructure vital to the revival of progressive government in the UK, and the Centre for Progressive Policy, a think tank championing inclusive economic growth. We're also really glad to have support from the Institute for Global Change, who provide us with exceptional research and briefings, and also partner with a fantastic Labour list, bringing to life many of the issues, themes and discussions we're covering on the pod.
Need new glasses or want a fresh new style? Warby Parker has you covered. Glasses start at just $95, including anti-reflective, scratch-resistant prescription lenses that block 100% of UV rays. Every frame's designed in-house with a huge selection of styles for every face shape. And with Warby Parker's free home try-on program, you can order 5 pairs to try at home for free. Shipping is free both ways, too. Go to warbyparker.com/covered to try 5 pairs of frames at home for free. warbyparker.com/covered.
Whether you're a morning person or a bedtime procrastinator, everyone deserves a mattress that works for their style. And you'll find the best mattress for you at Ashley. The new Temper-Adapt collection at Ashley brings you one-of-a-kind body-conforming technology, making every sleep tailored to be your best. The collection also features cool-to-the-touch covers and motion absorption to help minimize sleep disruptions from partners, pets, or kids. Shop the all-new Temper-Adapt collection at Ashley, in-store or online at ashley.com. Ashley, for the love of home.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
So
So, Robert, tell the people, what's a pretendian?
It's just what it sounds like, Angel. A pretend Indian.
Someone who fakes being one of us?
Someone who impersonates a native.
We're talking about real scammers and con artists.
There are pretendians teaching at universities, pretendians running governments, pretendians in Hollywood.
On our new podcast, Pretendians, we'll tell you the incredible story of these jaw-dropping frauds.
Who are they? Why do they do it? And how the heck do they keep getting away with it?
Listen to Pretendians on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.